Welcome to our pandemic political education dialogue. My name is Anjali Nath Upadhyay, and we're recording on August 29th, 2020. So first off, I want to thank the American Studies Association and Dr. Dylan Rodriguez for creating this Freedom Courses series and orchestrating this. Also want to thank all of our listeners tuning in and all of the community educators that we're humbly extending the legacy of that have been doing this work for quite some time. Of course, I also want to give a shout out to Michael James. Thank you so much for taking the time to be down to be in dialogue. Maybe we can just share a little bit of context related to what inspired this dialogue. So we've both devoted decades to political education and are going to be sharing some reflections based off of those experiences and some of the work that we're currently doing, and especially to support folks that might be holding teach-ins or they might be doing radical study groups, but might not have been able to get as into the amazing tradition of liberation pedagogy as we have been able to get into over the course of our lives. So sharing in a way that hopefully can be supportive for folks doing this kind of work. So perhaps we can start off by sharing just a little bit about the work that we do and then just get right into it. I do work in a project that I founded almost 6 years ago called Liberation Spring, that is a grassroots community education program that exists totally independently from the academic industrial complex. And we've been 100% donation-based, pay what you can, no one turned away for lack of funds since the inception of the project. And it's an incredibly special space in the sense that we're able to do work that is unapologetically in the service of collective liberation and more specifically decolonization, as opposed to, right, getting wrapped up in whatever the kinds of censorship, right, or gatekeeping that is so commonly associated with doing educational work in institutions looks like for a lot of our loved ones and for, frankly, most, right, formal educators within the settler-colonial US today. So definitely a little bit of what I'm going to be sharing is informed by that experience with so many incredible folks that have come through to that space within the past 5 years, but then also as an educator working in the fields of political science, indigenous politics, women's studies for my career so far. How about you, Michael?
Yeah, well, good to see you and great to work with you. You know, I've had a really feel like it's very special to have worked with a colleague who's just been so engaged in alternative pedagogies and just so dedicated to making sure that people have access to it. Yeah, I was a product of a really bad education system, ghetto schools in San Francisco back in the day. And going to school during a time that I'm a Vietnam War civil rights era person, and watching education fail basically, or succeed as the case might be. But I'm definitely a child of the Ella Baker School, a first-gen university person that encountered Paulo Freire's work when I was in the university. And actually ended up meeting him later on down the line in the 80s. Started some development of popular education work in the US with about 30 other projects that were UN type 1C3 type organizations. But doing grassroots education work in Bay Area. Right now I'm working with the Young Women's Freedom Center as a sort of their education OG. They are a group of activist educators, women that have been mostly engaged in the prison industrial complex, either as inmates or as advocates. Mostly grassroots, former sex workers, former women who have grown up in what they call in the game, in the street. And they are all advocates, some of the most brilliant advocates and activists, abolitionist types, empowerment types. So I've been working with them for like 25 years. They developed their own educational program called Education as a Practice of Freedom. Discovered me and discovered that I was in the same vein and said, we're going to put you to work for us. So I do sort of the training and development for them. Yeah, there are young leaders ranging from ages from 18 to 40 now. They work with, they're doing advocacy. They're trying to close prisons, especially women's prisons, working on the decriminalization of women, and doing basic community education with women both inside and outside to create activists not just to reform the system. They're generating a grassroots working class women, trans, cis, to become advocates for themselves. So I feel very, very fortunate to have my work of 45 years to have relevance to this organization. They're definitely my teachers, and also it's been the place where we've been developing our methodology over the last 35, 40 years. And so when I met you too, you saw me right in the beginning of a return to doing this work here. And so, yeah, so that's what's up. They're still doing active work in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing that little bit of context. Well, I'm so curious to get a sense of some of what, right, within the context of this pandemic and uprising and, right, settler-colonial election season and all of the things that we're swirling in right now, right, the wildfires, of course, in California and the storms, right, in the south of the settler-colonial US really kicking up right now. Some of what you have found to be supportive, right, of the folks that you work with pedagogically. So, right, for our listeners that might be kind of starting to dabble in political education a little more substantially right now, what might you want to share with them in terms of, could even be a cautionary tale, right, but especially what has been super supportive?
You know, the virtual education is quirky, right? But what's working for us is, you know, the young activists and teachers that I work with have been in so much motion in their lives. We're a community accustomed to chaos. You know, I grew up in a family of 9 people in the hood. These young women have done. They've just been in all kinds of drama and tension. So in one sense, what I call the Corona stall has enabled people to be still. And that stillness, in that stillness, in having to sit in front of a screen and work with each other, has created a space, in a sense, to be reflective and to be not exposed to all of the frequencies of and the tensions of having to do demonstrations, or having to go to the Sacramento to lobby for closure of prisons, or having to do, some of them are doing literally housing women who are being released. They're so engaged. So in one sense, the educational process has put us in this virtual space, but it enables us, as we're learning how to navigate it, that space is given us to put the action reflection dynamic into a better stasis. I think that's a positive thing, and it forces us to communicate, bring our humanity into the circle. It forces us to be more intentional about that, rather than just assume because you can see each other on the screen and you can put words out that's actually connecting. We're actually really trying. They're really working at, how are you doing? What's going on with you? What's in your space? They have their children in the backgrounds, they're kind of like things like that, but they're in their home spaces. And I think that's something that's happening too, where I'm recognizing that how we learn and where we learn has to do with how comfortable we are in the environment that we're communicating from. So that's one insight that I think that is a positive. Even though people are feeling a lot of negativity about digital space, I understand that. For us and for our work, depending on scale, like we've gone from meeting with 8 people to meeting with 4. And that's made a big difference. So we've had to learn how do you have dialogue with 8 people on a screen? It looks like the Brady Bunch on TV, right? You do 3 or 4, it works a lot better. So I find the calmness and the intentionality of this moment enables us to communicate, to share story, to do analysis, to listen better. So that's one thing that say you got make lemonade, right? We're making this work, and it makes us slow down and really listen to. I mean, I'm learning about. I've been with a couple of these leaders here for 20 years. I'm learning things about them now that I didn't know before, because we're being more intentional about how we share, how we contextualize what we're doing. So that's one notion. How about you in your space?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that reminds me of what you were speaking to around how this virtual medium for folks that are doing consciousness raising work, popular education online right now, can actually be supportive in ways that might be counterintuitive or surprising to folks, is kind of like you were saying with, you know, children running around in the background for communities or for circles that might, right, not have, say, had kids in meeting spaces previously. It can allow actually a certain kind of intimacy, exactly like I just heard you speaking to, that can be super beneficial actually. So yeah, also it's interesting because it's like within the context of Liberation Spring, we've been doing remote political education for years prior to the pandemic, and it can be incredible on so many fronts. So for sure, in terms of accessibility, we have so many folks tuning in that either, right, are parents or caregivers that would never be able to make it physically to a community center, right, or a campus if they wanted to be on a campus, to be able to come together to do liberatory education with other folks. Of course, we have folks who are disabled also and who are in geographically isolated regions that wouldn't be able to be in some of the kinds of dialogues that they're able to be in because popular educators, right, have made space available and accessible, right, to varying degrees on the internet. And so to me, it is really important to underscore really amazing possibilities within the context of digital consciousness raising, instead of just kind of presuming like, oh, this is, right, such a kind of paltry, right, alternative to being able to connect face to face. Because like I heard you speaking to, I hear people sharing that kind of presupposition so cavalierly, and that's not necessarily the case at all. Like for an educator, for example, for me, one of the things that I love about doing digital education, and again, as someone that when I was teaching on campus, I never wanted the online classes. I was like, I'm not even interested in that. Don't even talk to me about that. Like face-to-face is what's up. The boundary setting and maintenance of like class starts at 6, that's when I see people, it ends at 9, that's when I'm turning the computer off, can be really supportive. And that you don't have the, you know, necessarily people wanting to engage in ways that can be tricky to navigate when you do have the kind of ambiguity of, especially for, you know, campus educators, it's like the student that walks all the way back to the office with you, or is like walking to your car to the parking lot because they want to continue to engage in a way that can be laborious to have to kind of bracket or to have to negotiate. Like that doesn't show up in the same kind of way in my experience in digital education. And that can be really supportive for those of us, especially that have been socialized to be caregivers, right? Or to overextend ourselves, or for those of us that are no stranger to burnout, like the way that we can curate space and the way that we can hold a container can actually be super supportive again in ways that might be surprising to people that might be a little bit newer to this particular kind of mode of engagement.
Do you find yourself bringing out more from each individual in your group?
That's interesting. I mean, in different ways. So also on that front, you know, it's like for people that are using Zoom or whatever platform they're using, it's amazing to be able to have access to a chat in real time at the same time as people being able to be in dialogue, because some of us know, right, a lot of, right, learners really can benefit from, right, having that option available to them that for whatever reason that could make a whole lot of sense, right, might not be as interested in immediately verbalizing themselves or vocalizing themselves in the same kind of way. So the chat function can also serve different, right, challenges for sure, in terms of, you know, this kind of mythology of multitasking, like for a facilitator having to attend to both things simultaneously. And if something is happening in the chat that merits attention, do you need to interrupt the flow of a dialogue to be able to go there and dip back in and out, right? So there's a lot to navigate. And at the same time, it opens up possibilities, or like someone being able to private message you something if something is coming up that wouldn't necessarily have been possible if we were in a community center sitting in a circle together, like so many of us experienced previously, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess I was thinking about too, just the different, you know, in the U.S., of course, in this what you call settler-colonial kind of framework, with the 4 major crises going on here, from the Trump moment to COVID-19 to the police murders and the climate change issue, all of these things kind of create an incredible disruption in aspects of American life. For the people I'm working with, it's just a different degree of disruption. As you know, these are women of color. We've experienced the sharpest edge of this, the most corrosive edge of this system anyway. But having said that, how are people understanding kind of the abstraction of all these different things you're talking about in Liberation Spring? Like are people, when they say settler colonialism, when they think about these kind of abstract things, in this moment, how are they talking about it? How are they feeling it? Maybe that's what I'm asking you in your space. And I'll talk about how that's happening in my space. But I want to hear, as you talk about it, you know, in some ways, so you can get virtual like this, and then everybody can sound very prolific and very profound. At the same time, we're already being abstracted by the digital imagery. You know what I'm saying? We're already at distance. And then the intellectual tradition that we're in allows us to sort of distance ourselves and sound like we know about something, but not necessarily be able to express how we're grounded in that understanding. Like, say, for example, how are people feeling about what just happened in Kenosha, and how are they dying? How are you working that dynamic with your students?
Yeah. You know, being so intentional about bringing in embodiment is one of the ways that we mitigate that. And, you know, within the context of settler colonialism in particular, right, and feeling into what it is that we're engaging, and also just making space to acknowledge that we're actually always already feeling into the things to begin with. It's just so often people don't acknowledge that, right? Or there's not space to be able to recognize that, especially if that's not authorized or validated in a certain space, depending upon the approach to knowledge that's getting centralized. I don't know if you saw, but I was texting back and forth with so many folks about this last night. But the Black National Convention section on land back, I was just like crying. It was so beautiful seeing, you know, it's like the movement for Black Lives didn't need to include, right, Nick Tilson, who's dealing with these horrific charges because of the demonstrations at Mount Rushmore, but they did, right? And so really we just actually last week in class were getting into this amazing zine that, I don't know if you're familiar with, one of the co-founders of the Indigenous Kinship Collective. They go by the moniker Faggot Planet, and they created this land back zine that has an incredible section on the hashtag lands back and anti-Blackness kind of intersection. And so, yeah, like we go there, but first and foremost through our bodies, right? Because if not, it's just so much more likely that we could be making things up abstractly that's not actually materially moored in anything that's consequential within our lives. So to give a few examples of what on earth that looks like every class of ours starts off with an invitation to share 3 deep inhalations and exhalations, just to kind of pause, right, to ground in our bodies if folks are feeling it. And if they're not, no worries in the least, it's totally voluntary. And starts off after that with an optional check-in where I always encourage people to keep it truthful, like it's a real how are you? And it is prior to delving into the material that we're looking at during any given week. So when someone is like, I'm waiting to see if my COVID results come back positive, we have a little bit more of a sense of what they're bringing into our dialogue about precarity for that week, right? And so making space to be able to witness one another and be witnessed in those seemingly personal dimensions of the political, so to speak, and modeling and habituating, validating that as part of the work that's an absolute necessity, right? Those are a couple of the kinds of, you know, tools or tips or tricks that we use to really habituate that. And to me, part of the not so clandestine, right, learning objective there is, I hope that, right, participants take those practices into all of the other spaces. Like, I'm going to breathe, I'm going to see how I am, I'm going to see how other people are. And that's the non-negotiable starting point to enter into where we've got any capacity to curate a space together, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because I do think that over the years in this work, what people in the frame, what I call in the context of popular education, which, originates in Latin America, Africa in the late 60s and 70s, and then makes its way up to North America and to Europe through Freire's publication, et cetera, then people like us grab onto it and we riff off of it. We've done some variations on the theme. One thing that I've noticed is that, especially in the young people's and feminist expressions of this work, where the mind-body kind of sensibilities, the somatic aspects is more attended to. I know that's true in Black community. I say, I'm Black and Japanese, that's mixed race people, right? We know, right? Well, we've created spaces for those cultural aspects, our own innate sense of integration, to be a part of the pedagogy and to honor that, right? Honor what our bodies are going through, honor what our senses are going through. Well, also this is heavily influenced by the emergence of sexual consciousness, gender consciousness. We have one of our trans educators are like, they're just outrageous, in terms of enabling everybody else to say that your consciousness is more than what you think it is. But I also think about, even like I was teasing, we have this one educator, and she works with young women that are just out of the juvenile justice system. She was telling me yesterday, when we start the group, like we do a breathing exercise, et cetera, because they're inside the house and their bodies are so amped up because they're on all the time. And so it takes a few minutes just for us to detox, to decompress that anxiety. She says, it doesn't always work, but I do breathing. And we're teasing her because, I feel like I'm out of the system myself, but I feel like a hippie educator. And we're laughing about that. But those are some of the discoveries that we had to make, that, we are not just, I'm an old school in the movement. All of consciousness was intellectual development. We didn't acknowledge in that gendered way, we didn't acknowledge that our bodies are affected by oppression. And so that's why I started working with the Young Women Freedom Center. One thing that I noticed 25 years ago, I would meet with them in the group and we'd start our circle. And I'd say, well, where did you just come from? Oh, we just came from the Kibuchi Hot Springs. And I was laughing because I'm imagining these young, formerly street workers getting a massage. And they said, this is one of the dimensions of our work. We don't know what to call it. We just call it healing. But that changed my work, because I said, oh, they're paying attention to all of these things, especially in the chaos that they know. I say, I can't focus if I'm hungry. I can't focus if I'm injured. I can't focus if I can't see. I can't focus if I'm loaded. I can't focus if I'm traumatized. Let me be real about my body. And I'm a woman whose body is under observation, is under pressure all the time. So 3 minutes of breathing, inhaling and exhaling, to me, is quite a political act. And they were doing it. So even as you mentioned that, especially when we're working with educated people, which we do too, right, who don't think of themselves as having endured the kind of pressures that, the community has, they might feel like, well, I'm always breathing.
Right.
I was just talking to a colleague yesterday, and we said the first thing oppression does is it stops your breathing.
Right. Because
we were talking about respiration, aspiration, inspiration. We fool around with those concepts all the time, right?
Right.
Thinking about that. So even as you said that, I look at that as an entirely, in a sense, you're disrupting what everybody's going through that they may not.
That's right.
And I look at you as an educator, you say, no, this is not therapy or counseling. I'm just saying, I understand what's happening to us in this context. Therefore, I'm going to say, everybody get on the mat, relax.
Well, and the thing about that is, so often it's the folks with the most credentials or the most institutionalized education that need this the most, right? And so that's something actually, another one of the things that we do typically at least once per seasonal class, and that we just did 2 weeks back is hold a traditional kind of consciousness raising circle. And it was so revelatory for folks during one of those 4 circles, because one of the PhD students in the circle said, because, you know, for a consciousness raising circle, it's not like we had an assignment. It's not like people were watching a documentary, right, coming into the circle, or it's not like they were reading some scholarly journal article or something like that. I was like, no, just like show up as you are. That's all you need to do. That's all the prep work that's necessary. We'll take it from there. You don't have to worry about anything. And she said at the beginning of the circle, she's like, I didn't even know that we could come together to do that. I didn't even know this was possible, right? And so it's so in part devastating, and it's so in part evidencing how important that kind of intervention is, to realize, like, did you know that you already have things to contribute even if you didn't read a journal article, right? And so that, right, supporting people's understanding that what is within them already and what they're experiencing, their lived experience, merits, right, critical reflection. It merits, right, witnessing. And that's one of those things that, of course, right, so many different approaches to knowledge production go out of their way to invalidate, and historically have, right, courtesy of white supremacist, capitalist, settler, colonial, right, cis heteropatriarchal imperialism for centuries now. And so that to me is part of the point of also using these techniques that really encourage people collectively to not incessantly seek education externally, right? In this kind of way that, like, well, yeah, Google told you to do it, right? These corporations with all of their propaganda related to an information age, right? Or an attention economy that are trying to monopolize our economy are like, I'll tell you what learning is. Like, find this corporate platform like Google and type a keyword into it, and then look at another, right, corporation or sort of manicured perception of reality, Wikipedia or whatever it might be, and read something, and then you're educated, because that's what learning is, right? Which is just such a shallow non-engagement with what is actually possible. But that has really co-opted so many people's understanding of what education is. It's just the most like corporatized, consumerist, like I bought a thing in a transaction, so now I know. Not like I think, therefore I am, but like I consumed, therefore I know, or whatever it might be. Right. Like people are really dealing with that. And that has epic implications in terms of how people even understand what learning is and isn't, and in a way that's so often horrifically self-effacing. So making space to really confront that and combat that, so that then people even have, right, an increased likelihood to be able to take seriously what they might know if they were, right, encouraged to pay attention and to have some respect for that perception.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know if your viewers can do that. I shared this photograph with you of some of the people we work with, right? And I just wanted to to make sure people know that we actually have people we work with, right? But I thought about you, what you had just said in this way, when you talk about knowledge production, because of course for grassroots folks, working class folks who have not had the privilege of formal education, which a lot of the young women I work with don't have. One of the kind of core principles that I see, you got that old school sense of this too, is we have to know that we have to discover our own knowledge, right? That was what Paulo Freire was talking about, what Ivan Gibar was talking about, what they're talking about down in Chiapas. Discover your own knowledge, appreciate your knowledge, right? So what's so interesting about you is that even in privilege and in higher education, et cetera, that actually doesn't happen, because knowledge is owned by somebody else, right? And I don't care if you graduated magna cum laude or whatever, right, and written 3 books, people don't all, that's like you mentioned the person who said to you, oh, we get to do this here? Is that possible? That to me is how oppression works. It makes you doubt your own authority. Or it tells you don't have authority unless somebody else says so. Without sliding over into that whole postmodern thing about that, right? It's like, of course, you don't have any authority. Disciplines, if you don't do this discipline, you don't have authority. So, yeah, we encounter that all the time, because even in a moment of incredible clarity incredible good work. You know, some of the people that I work with, they've been through so much. They've accomplished so much. But, you know, they've been through a lot too. Like one colleague of mine said, I'm still in my trauma. I'm not out of it, able to do that. I'm always still in it. So even in moments of real clarity, they'll come back and reflect. Like, say, for example, they just had to do a policy meeting in Sacramento with the state legislature. And I'm telling you, I'm always worried about them because they say you're always vulnerable because of the power that, well, they go and do things anyway, and they actually command a lot of attention and authority. But when they come back, they're exhausted because they felt so exposed, you know. And at the same time, I know part of that exhaustion is that, do I really feel confident about the authority of my experience? So part of what we're trying to do here is say, yeah, you'll feel that authority more as you're able to contextualize your experience, to know the social, political, economic, historical dimensions of your experience, but not just the theoretical aspects of that, but also know that you're a historical person.
Right.
You're carrying that story for everybody else. And that, of course, may exhaust you, but better to be tired knowing what you know.
Thank you.
Tired just because you behaved in a certain way. But everybody experiences that at some level. I think maybe the certified, credentialed individual may have less of an awareness of their doubt.
Sure. Right.
You know what I mean? Because I have friends with PhDs who have gone to reviews, get blasted in a peer review, and feel like they didn't know anything.
Right.
You know, just because some asshole says you don't know something, now you feel like your knowledge is gone or is not valid. And the other thing I listen to what you're talking about is that in the academic tradition, which we both know, our knowledge, our experiences are not acknowledged.
Yep. Right.
Right. So then you say, well, my data, the research that I have to validate. I've watched people of color who have got first gens who have gone to the university that said, well, I never got to talk about what I went through. I never got to do a social biography.
Yep.
In 8 years,
Yep.
I never got to talk about myself. That was never considered valid data, empirical evidence. I go, well, yeah, of course not, right? What were the Native American boarding schools about?
Right. Well, and you know, around that, it's non-negotiable to keep it as specific as possible, if you ask me, whether that's being place-based or like you're talking about within the context of social biography. Because if not, and I'm sure you might have observed this too, but ambiguity can get exploited all the time when we're not super specific, for sure related to positionality, related to social location. And so, and you know, in the context of say this pandemic, I mean, talking about race, talking about class, talking about gender, talking about, right, whatever it might be specifically. And I mean, there's so many examples that we could talk about of this, right? Like I even, the shit I do for our collective liberation, I'm on some social media platforms, which is someone that is taken security culture seriously, right? My entire adult life is nothing I would have ever considered were it not specifically within the context of the strategic purpose. But even in the past day, I was posting something on Liberation Springs Instagram stories related to, so Tamika Mallory, right, of the Until Freedom organization was talking about, right, yearning for this kind of almost like Montgomery bus boycott style, like catalyzing, galvanizing moment right now. And so the kind of caption that I wrote attached to that repost was, for people who have the capacity, turn the fuck up now more than you ever have before. Right. And to me, it's non-negotiable to share that, because why? If not, I can anticipate from a mile away, and not just, you know, my students or LS participants, myself, how many of my loved ones, it's like the folks that would be like, oh, that's right, I should throw down harder, are so often the ones that are like, no, but for you throwing down harder means like taking a nap. Like, could you dare yourself to ask someone to watch your kid for an hour, right? Or to pick up groceries for you, or but, and it's like, multidirectionally so often, right, when we do just speak in abstraction, coming full circle to what we were talking about earlier, in a way that is not rooted and grounded and contextual and place-based and specific in our social biographies, in our time and space, you know, something like that. It's like the same people with so much astounding, not only unchecked privilege, but also, resources and access that they could be throwing down, will be like, no, I think I'm going to take a nap. It's all good, and not challenge themselves. And then those of us that are hemorrhaging and that are exhausted and that are on the brink of burnout will be like, oh no, that's right. I should throw down harder. And in a way that, not to be counter-revolutionary, but that context is important, right?
Yes. So in the sense that you titled this thing the pandemic political education, or political education in this context, the organization that I'm working with has been directly hit by coronavirus. So bodies have been impacted. Of course, this is women of color mostly. Those are, of course, those are the highest risk populations. And so we're dealing with that internally, the injury, the fear. Based on what you were just saying, it reminded me that there's always been a little bit of a reflection on the sort of the obsessive compulsive nature of social movements, especially in the global north. And to me, you'll hear probably a little bit of my bias here. I think that when middle class educated people discover oppression, and they've been raised in the context of achievement and performance, and even when work gets professionalized, and in the capitalist framework, production is very important, right? How much you produce. Look at the language of the nonprofits: outcomes, 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 right? So you're tied into this obsessive compulsive behavior, volume-oriented behavior. And even in the left, right, it's very, very production-oriented. I mean, I still got my critique of it in the old Leninist concepts. It's still an industrial revolution model of social change. It's still patriarchal. It's still very male-centric. It's also body-centric. Well, the productive body is between 15 and 50, and after that you're waste. I mean, there's all those kind of women produce less. All of these things, right? So then we tap in, and I think that I was just talking with another colleague about this. What kind of direct action? An old civil rights SNCC organizer was telling my colleague, the movement needs to do more direct action. So they're having a big argument about that. And I think that there is direct action is it's sort of a misnomer, right? Because political action should always be direct, and all politics is direct. There's the indirect. Direct is a false construct, because it has all action. What makes an action concrete is its substance, its theoretical, its historicity, not the fact that it's being done. So it's saying, like, do we know if our work is effective? Well, effective for what? That's still a problem in organizing up here in the United States, right? Because why is it not, me, I follow that Gramscian notion that all methodological failure comes from an ideological error. And people do stuff all the time. And one thing what we do is we exhaust ourselves. But I think that exhaustion is rooted in is a subjective problem, not an objective problem. There are not that many people that think of themselves intentionally being in the social movements. So that also tells you scale is a problem. We have to be aware of that. If one person is doing the work that 100 people should be doing, you're going to get tired. Be careful. Know that that's the reality. But that doesn't mean you're supposed to carry that 100 people's weight. One thing I like about working with the people that I'm working with now, they're more aware of that because they're aware of limits, physical and otherwise. I also think that because they're women, they understand the limits of the body. Mm-hmm. Also, they understand how to stretch those limits to the max, especially the mothers, the parents. Mm-hmm. I understand limits. Right. I also understand what my capacity is.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So that's what I liked about what you're saying too, because we are a disembodied, empowerment in our society, the intellectual society, the educated society is so intellectual, right? Develop yourself in your head and you will get ahead.
Exactly.
And a lot of our physical illness in this society is because our bodies are underdeveloped.
Sure. Well, and the thing around that is also, it's like people can make up whatever abstraction they want and adhere to it pretty hard, but that doesn't mean that there are not going to still be reverberations and ripple effects and consequences that they're going to have to deal with inevitably in one way or another. And so also even on that front, maybe 3 weeks ago, I canceled class for all 4 sections of this season's course. And in the handful of times that I have ever done that, it's been so edifying for so many folks, and I get so many sincere thanks. And I said very specifically, like, I'm feeling the vibe. I know that so many folks are like pretty exhausted right now. We have nurses and so many so-called frontline, right, essential workers within our community of participants, caregivers, parents, right, folks that are being stretched way too thin right now. And I also, right, modeled like this. Educators are humans too. Do people know this? Like, I am exhausted. I see so many of y'all are exhausted, and give thanks we're capable of adapting accordingly and not just kind of subscribing to some route pre-designated agenda, but actually being attuned with presence to what is unfolding right now and then switching things up accordingly. And folks were, so grateful. And I also framed it within the context of, right, so much of the work in terms of the formal, right, curriculum itself that we've been getting into related to what labor gets recognized and what labor, right, goes invisibilized, and how completely political that is, right? And, it's like, in terms of the context of this distinction that some people make, say, between activism and community organizing, like, sure, you could throw down hard for a campaign right now in the next 2 weeks and then burn out and then have some really harmful impact reverberating months, seasons, years into the future potentially, or to keep it real, turn so many people off by this kind of, right, particular mode of engagement at the expense of other potentially more viable possibilities that we could be considering that actually could be more generative moving forward for the rest of our lives. So also zooming out, and wherever we can summon it, having some perception of that long game or that long view, so to speak, which might reveal different sensibilities right now that are also probably in our body were we to be consciously paying attention to begin with, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because that's, we always say we're pilgrims of the self-evident, right? You know what I mean? Like, these things should be obvious to us, but of course they're not, right? I told you, I think I shared with you last week. So I'm doing a small Zoom session we call Reading Circle, and one of our colleagues, she's older, former inmate, wonderful person, comes from an indigenous Pacific Island background, comes to the Zoom meeting. But I'm looking, I said, what's going on? She's lying in her hospital bed because she's ill right now. She said, I just wanted to make sure I was accountable to the circle.
Yeah.
And I thought, and for all of us in the circle, we're like going, okay, you know what? We know you're accountable. Cool, we got you, right? And then we let her go in that minute. But I thought, wow, as even when you suggested this activity, I go, oh, Anjali wants some context. So I go, boy, how do you get that? This colleague of ours is in it. Also, she is not invulnerable. And in fact, our morbidity and mortality is always higher. People say, oh, look at who is it impacted? Because, well, yeah, right. Actually, there are greater threats to morbidity and mortality in Mexico and in communities, even in California, that are much more greater threats than coronavirus right now. And that's always been the case. So we're at risk. Oppression is risk, right? So as you were saying that too, I think that I was thinking about you went to I think you went to Chiapas, or was it Oaxaca, to the women's conference recently?
Yeah, it was 2 springs ago, and the first international, right, women who struggle against capitalism, EZLN convocation. So the first major, right, international event that Zapatista women specifically have put on.
Yeah, what made me think about that is that it's sort of like they're from the things that you told me and the things I gleaned from it, there's such a high sensitivity to the physical reality of ourselves, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Right.
And it's a sharpened sensitivity because it's informed by indigenous philosophies and consciousness and experience. And then it's informed by ecofeminist for, that framework, right? Informed by those of us who are really rediscovering our physical selves. You know what I mean? Where we say, well, let me go over here, because if I go over here, I can be a physical person. I can be a person in nature and in the world. And this to me is about when we talk about, well, how do you do direct action, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes what I hear is the same kind of language that I heard when I was working with my dad in the auto industry, learning how to do that. The language is technical and mechanical, and that you're there for your utility. I mean, that's why I resisted academic language. You're there for utility, and your utility is disembodied from, you're disembodied.
Absolutely.
It's a bizarre construct, right? I mean, this probably goes back centuries in the first moments of science and technology, whether it was,
right,
you know what I mean, building aqueducts in Rome, or doing agriculture, from nomadic indigenous people learning how to do agriculture. When we found ourselves that when we discovered our technological consciousness, we started messing with nature. But we didn't realize that our bodies we're messing with that too.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. And now we're just kind of rediscovering, although there are errors in how we organize. There are errors in how we develop science and technology. There are errors depending on what our intention is.
Absolutely. Right.
Right?
Well, and the thing is also that kind of, I really appreciate your bringing in this kind of like, what John Trudell would call a mechanistic mentality, right? Or this like techno-fundamentalism, to make it plain.
Like you found, right?
That I see every single day, that turning off so many people from our movements when that gets so deeply internalized into movement spaces and ways of organizing. And so, right, something else that's really concerning on that front is, it's like this sort of Cartesianism, like unchecked Cartesianism playing out in activist spaces that I hear you speaking to. One, for so many of us, that's not exactly our issue, so to speak, to begin with. If we do actually subscribe to other cosmologies, that's not so Eurocentric and disembodied. And then unfortunately, because, what in the hell is like left, right, binary from the like French seating arrangement in their assembly, like left wing and right wing of the same bird the last time I checked. Like there's not, from a whole lot of, right, decolonial and indigenous perspectives, that's like not exactly the most, right, liberatory, right, framing or unnecessary dualism or binarism to be intentionally perpetuating to the extent that happens. And that does actually turn off so many people that could otherwise be much more interested in movement spaces, right, and showing up to do the work that actually needs to be done right now, were we to be telling different stories with other wordsmithing, with other forms of meaning making that might be more ancestrally relevant and culturally meaningful to so many of us than thinking there's something like intrinsically interesting about still talking about these French paradigms from centuries ago that have like nothing to do with so many of us, right? So the thing about that is, in so many so-called leftist spaces, so many people are just like cutting and pasting, just like you're saying, the same old like industrial revolution, techno-fundamentalist, mechanistic approach to, right, like the body is a machine, just give yourself more fuel so then you can, right, show up for our movements being the most revolutionary cog in the machine possible. And that disproportionately devastates and desecrates some of us first and faster than everyone else along very predictable lines of privilege and oppression. And so that's part of why, say for me, just to make it plain, right, say within the context of LS and other spaces, to do a decolonial feminist pedagogy involves, to the fullest extent possible, like leaving that at the door to make space for modes of, right, doing the work, so to speak, that don't devastate us, that don't destroy our bodies. And that's not about not being as down for the cause, so to speak. What do we even understand the cause to be? Like, even if people wanted to get Machiavellian, like, you don't actually, we've got lots of modes of meaning making here available to us. Like, if the means are, right, so quickly or deftly defaulting to like, yes, I'll martyr myself because that's what I was told I need to do, without even pausing to ask, is there another means available to us to arrive at whatever end it is that we're interested in? And for a whole lot of us, teleologically, like the means are the ends to begin with. Like, why am I doing the job of capitalism, killing myself, but for the sake of collective liberation? No thanks. No, I'm not here for that. Like, other people can, I wish you didn't, but I'm not here for that. I'm not going to model that to people I care about.
So let's work this. I want to work this with you because you know, we use the phrase, you know, because just kind of, we can code switch to talk about leaving shit at the door, right? But I think between you and me, and I'll just challenge this thing because we both have to deal with it, right? Like decolonizing ourselves is not just as simple as leaving something at the door, because if it's internalized, if it's the way we formed ourselves, or we were formed. Now, I've said to you before, my part of my background, I'm a recovering addict. So it wasn't just a matter of detoxification. I had to relearn, rediscover my body, but also rediscover my soul. I've always said too that there should be a group called Oppressed People's Anonymous, OPA, because oppression makes you a dope fiend. It makes you behave in codependent and dependent ways, right? But yet and still, like the old folks used to say, yet and still, you have to recover. Your recovery is both collective and individual. So as you're saying that, I'm thinking, it's not self-evident that there are even other modes that exist if you've only been formed in one way, right? I mean, to give credit to that French guy who talked about the disciplines, right?
I mean, I don't need to.
Oh, you don't need to give credit to the French. Okay, we don't have to give credit to the French. I mean, it's not like, I have to say that it's not like people didn't know about dialectics and deconstruction before Foucault. I'm sure we were talking about that at Plymouth Rock. You know, like, you know, like what is wrong with these people, right? but you know, like when you say too, like even to suggest, because we're going through this here, the hardest thing here is as our leaders, these young women build themselves up and get skilled, they get mechanistic because they're good at it. They're good at it, which is both good and bad. One person came back the other and said, I'm getting bad at my social biography. When I get into a meeting, I just start talking about decriminalization and how punishment is a meta narrative and blah blah blah. I go, no, you got to do your social biography. You got to represent, because don't you know that your skill, your jujitsu, is enabling them to see you as a person. And they laugh and they go, no, you know, I beat his ass around the policy issue. There's a risk because, in a sense, the whole modality of our culture is intellectual, is commodified, the commodification of ideas, the commodification of bodies. So we say, oh, decolonize. Well, decolonization, we got to put that into the framework too. You don't end 500 years of what happened to you just by changing your behavior.
That's right. That's right.
Right? It doesn't just happen. So as I was saying that too, in a way, I know that we're intimating, like we even did this show too. We're talking about this. This is what they discovered, you know, because so they were saying we're teaching a group of young women their rights, but we don't feel like we're doing liberation pedagogy. And I go, well, which one of these you think you're doing? So what we're doing mostly information. I go, well, what are you trying to do? We're trying to do this. And I go, yeah, you know, most socialization is about formation. A lot of work we do is about information, but very little is about transformation, because transformation is way more complicated. So that's what I was thinking about when you're saying too, because I bet you when you intimate to your students, hey, step back, do this, and kind of like, you know, people tweak, they go, do I have permission?
Exactly.
Be in my body?
That's right.
And then you say yes, but they go, nobody's ever said yes to me before.
Exactly.
Nobody's ever said that was okay.
Right. Well, and especially if they've just been groomed to, right, focus disproportionately on that information piece, whether it's like education is memorizing and regurgitating, right? Like this classic banking model. And if they've been groomed to be good at that, or if they have been traumatized from being told that they're not good at that, then that, you know, trauma from, right, their experience with education, right, is something that has to be addressed to be able to, right, see what is available to us within the realm of healing our relationship with learning, to even make space to move into that transformative space, to not just be reactionary, to not just be caught in a trauma response, to know that we're allowed to pay attention to whether or not we are even caught in a trauma response, right? Instead of just going through the motions, right? If we're going to be present, we can't just perform, right? Or talk the way that we've noticed other people talking without even pausing to see, is that actually even suited to this moment in history right now? Like, if people might give you credit for that, but like really, with all of the intersecting issues that we're dealing with right now, is this even actually a response to that? Or are we just kind of by default going through the motions? Because that, like, I guarantee the disaster capitalists are not just going through the motions. Like the forces that are, right, the annihilationists are in certain ways, right, innovating in real time based off of how they can extract, like the vampires that they are, even more from our communities than was otherwise already the case. And so, right, what then is our responsibility to be able to summon whatever capacity to be more present in this moment that is, right, possible or available to us.
So that's what my curious about your pedagogy and your intentionality about that, because as I've gotten to know your work, you know, it's sort of like if capitalism and neoliberalism is like a race car, then what we're talking about is sort of like a dance. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? We're moving not as machines, right? But my question to you is because I look at you, I love your militancy, and I love your militancy about direct action and your militancy about work. And I also see that as the stark contrast between that and the internal movement that people are doing as they decolonize, as we detox, as we recover, as we heal. And I know that you encounter, now maybe it's like this, tell me if you, as a student of yours starts to really get into, or starts to really internalize all of this work, to me it reminds me of therapy, right? You get to a moment of awareness and actually you're more vulnerable, right? You're like, oh, you know what I mean? Because that's how it's supposed to work, right? That's how it's supposed to work. You're stronger, but you're more sensitive to yourself and others. And I'm wondering, in your case, because you deal with a lot of ideas, I know your groups deal with a lot of ideas, and the ideas are codifications and abstractions of different forms of oppression and liberation. So it's the volume of what you do, as I look over your sites and your workshops, is really intense. And I know that even if your students are doing well, I know that they're overwhelmed. Not in a bad way, but because it's like, there's a lot of awakening. Yet I also know that what you do, my sense of you is that you say, yeah, but I'm not just awakening your awareness of this particular problem. I also am tapping into how the shit affected you. And then they go, oh shit, I didn't know that was going to happen. Because I've been with you in a couple of sections where they're going like, I don't know whether I'm to reflect on post-structuralism or to cry.
Right. Mm-hmm. All of the above.
And you're inclined, or both, right? But you're inclined, as, you know, I've seen you, crying is fine. You know, we could, post-structuralism is going to be here after you finish. You know what I mean?
I mean, I hope not, frankly, but that's a whole other conversation for another time.
But you see, I mean, that's what it is. Yeah. It's not like we have a choice not to deal with all this complexity. But when we do make it plain, which I borrowed from Malcolm X, where to me, liberation pedagogy is about not making it simple, making it plain, embracing complexity, right? But when that happens, we know we have an emotional, psychological, spiritual response. Detoxing is not that easy. Decolonizing is no easy thing.
No.
Because we can see the damage done to our bodies and souls.
That's right.
Sometimes I wonder is the performance aspect of ourselves, especially in the movement, especially among intellectually gifted people, right?
Right.
I mean, is a performance is sort of like a defense mechanism against the hurt.
Absolutely, right. And so often unconscious and unintentional.
Yeah, and unconscious, right? Right?
That's right.
So it's not, right? Because they're saying like, well, let me perform like I'm in control.
Yep.
And you're saying though, and I'm saying too, it's like, well, that's okay for the moment. But you know, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, how do we deal with the damage, to flip that damage into healing and power and stay engaged.
Right, absolutely.
But you know that you create, what I've known in the space I've been with you, those are spaces of, they have some protection. There's a principle that you use. Well, let me catch you. I'm gonna like that trust circle thing, right? We're gonna go. You're gonna deep dive, and I'm gonna catch you, at least for now.
Exactly.
And maybe teach you how to catch yourself. But don't think that you ain't gonna fall or that you're not getting hit, because you are.
That's
And I
right.
think that's the illusion of people who come out of privilege. They feel like, well, I'm not dealing with these coarse edges of oppression. Now, part of me says that, well, you know, you need to know that you are, not just for yourself, but to know that everybody else is sort of like, what? How do you think you're not oppressed? What happened? You mean just because you went to the university, you got a college, you got an education, you know?
Exactly.
So that dissonance, there's a dissonance to me, a cognitive dissonance in the people we work with too, especially those who have had some privilege in their lives, right? That,
right.
oh, I'm not getting hurt as much as anybody else. And I go, well, what do you mean as much?
That's right. Precisely. Yeah. Epistemologies of ignorance, right? It's a
Yeah,
horrifically deadly form of false consciousness. People thinking.
Or cognitive dissonance, right?
That's right, which is so often, right, if we're going to use the medicalized language, it is a symptom of post-traumatic stress, which so many people have, and it's legit a neural injury, right? And it is non-negotiable to attend to that, right, to be able to move forward in a more substantial way where you're not constantly like, oh, well, maybe the settler-colonial US isn't an omnicide, so I don't need to actually be throwing down like my life is on the line, right? If you're in that tug of war, that back and forth, you're gonna be much less likely to be able to mobilize to get free because you're still, I mean, even scientists understand what's the first step of the scientific method. You have to state the problem. And if you haven't stated the problem, you're much less likely to be able to identify a solution, even if you're swirling in solutions, because you're like, is there a problem? I don't know if there's a problem, right? Like it's non-negotiable to attend to that, right?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is because, so what privilege does it insulates you, or it gives you the illusion that trauma's not happening to you. That's why I'm saying too. And then I know that a lot of intellectually developed political people say, oh, I know that that exists, but it's abstract. I know that in your circumstances, in your learning circles, people go, you're asking me, Anjali, to recognize trauma in my own situation and deal with my own dissonance about it.
That's right.
It's true in our circles too. We say, you know, I spent my whole life figuring out survival mechanisms. I ain't gonna let go of them survival mechanisms because that shit saved my life. Just the way I thought drugs were saving my life. Just the way, you know, cognitive dissonance ain't necessarily a bad thing, unless you're shooting it in your arm.
Yeah, and I mean, temporality is what's up. Like the CD that could have supported your survival 32 years ago, right? Is that the same as 12 years ago? Is that the same as right now? Is that going to be the same as tomorrow if we're alive tomorrow, and so on and so forth, right? So again, taking it back to being context dependent instead of getting caught in abstraction in a way that can be, you know, can totally fuck with our perception.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? Because I know that as I've, over the years, tried to communicate with community organizers and people on the left about the necessity of liberation pedagogy, many would say that, man, that's a lot of work, but people can get caught up in that, and then they you know, they get caught up in their feelings. They're not going to do anything. They're not going to act. And I kind of go, well, what do you mean caught up in their feelings, or or you know, what makes you think that it's not a political act to recover, to be whole?
Absolutely, right.
I don't ask that question anymore because I see their dissonance, right?
Sure, right. Well, and the thing about that is also, it's like, again, taking it back to the distinction that some folks make between activists and community organizers. Like, are you here to win one campaign? And then, you know, like, I just remember, it's like going back to when I was in college and I would spend some time periodically at this house in Tongva territory in LA that, Unite Here, so Hotel Workers Union, right, kind of collective house where people organized and a lot of the organizers lived together. And I was just horrified seeing some of the like disgustingly cis hetero patriarchal sketch tactics that, you know, like following workers home at night, like some woman that's working as a maid in a hotel because they want to be able to get her address to, right, try to mobilize her or, right, you know, activate her in their campaign. And it's like, one, never speak to me again, this is disgusting, right? But two, like this they're not intrinsically or inherently giving two fucks about that human. Like they're trying to get their numbers or their quotas, like the uninterrogated, internalized capitalist logic that is clearly still operating within their approach to activism in this case, without necessarily considering like, how do you, one, like you could get shot and potentially like rightly so if some random person was following you home because they wanted to organize you, you know? And so it's like, this is real. Like pretend like you're that person for a minute, right? And some of us have been those people that some activists tried to organize, like already what embarrassingly disempowering, right? Problematic language and a problematic mentality to take. So we need to, right, invite people to move back and pause and reflect on what the project even is to begin with, right? Because I'm not, again, a cog in someone's revolutionary machine, and I would never have the audacity to, like, do people care about consent? That is not a consensual way to engage with people, right? So are you some like self-proclaimed vanguard that's just trying to get like minions or the masses, some undifferentiated masses to do your bidding because you think you know what's best? Or does this actually have to do with supporting people's, right, own capacity to perceive with more clarity, to then be able to, with autonomy and self-determination, designate for themselves and their own communities what their project is, right? And so like that, those questions are non-negotiable to engage, to then be able to get more clear around what tactics are or are not going to be aligned with said project, right?
Yeah. No, I think you really crystallized what I think though is the larger historical contradiction. I mean, well, you and I have talked to too. The language of social change is a militarized language, right? From revolution to struggle to movements, tactics, strategy. Well, because it's true that oppression is a binary and is militarized. It requires the objectification and dehumanization of others. And resistance is necessary and tactics are necessary. All of that. I used to get really angry at my Alinskyite organizers for being so mechanistic. I used to get frustrated with them. And why don't you understand this or that? Now there's a part of me that says, no, because I remember when the Black Panther Party started out here, some people said, no, we're supposed to be nonviolent, blah, blah, blah. And somebody just said, we just took up Malcolm's and said, we aren't this is not a matter of violence and nonviolence. We're trying to defend ourselves, right? So I'm not mad at people. I'm not mad at us for being formed the way we're formed. I'm mad at the structure that formed us in this way, because I don't think it's a debate whether or not, like I don't get mad at organizers and say, well, you need to do this and this and this to get this. Sometimes you need to manipulate to do this. I used to argue that. I said, oh, that kind of manipulation is unethical. I feel that way at an ethical level. I feel that I'm a deep believer that people should choose their political action and choose to engage. I still believe that at the core. I'm not mad at when somebody goes, United says, let's just get people pumped up and we'll get out into the street. I'm not going to say don't do that. I get it. But if the larger objective is humanization, that's when I listen to what they're doing down in Chiapas. That's when I listen to the Zapatistas. They say, you know what? We're not crazy enough to think we're going to just jump out and overthrow the Mexican government. Why would we do that otherwise? Because we also know that that's not the fucking problem. It is a symptom of a larger problem, you know? And that also thing too is, I agree, but I'm back with you on page 2. I don't think that anybody in development who have benefited from development is capable in an easy way of decolonizing themselves. I mean, I spend time with people who haven't had the luxury of being educated. And part of the reason I choose that is that there's less obstruction, there's less illusion of agency. There's less actually to detox from. Absolutely. Now, having said that, because my intellect is what saved my life out of the ghetto.
Right.
But it's also what I had to do 20 years of therapy for, to think that don't run to your intellect to save your life. Because when I crashed and burned, my intellect wasn't saving me anymore. Right. I had my mind-body split. My mind-body split helped me survive my early trauma. But to live, I had to reintegrate and get help from people who understood that.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, that integration piece is everything, if you ask me. That, because if not, we can just continuously play the sort of, right, again, attention economy, information age in through one ear, out the other, without actually pausing to see, like, can we talk about praxis? Or like, how has this changed your life? Like, how are you embodying this? How are you operationalizing this, so to speak, in the best sense of that? Not just like some capitalist, right, sort of instrumentalization of knowledge. No, like, what is this for? Like, planet's on fire, people are unnecessarily dying and being harmed. Like, really, what are you going to do with this? Right? Because if not, there are so many illusions that so many of our folks are steeped in that would have them thinking like, oh, capitalism told me to be busy and to do all the time, so I'm just going to be, period, full stop, into infinity. Like, I don't need to actually do anything because I'm like beyond that capitalist mentality. And it's like, no, there's so much that needs to be done. Like, you can't stop there, right? So yeah, that's absolutely everything, whether it's like, again, being so intentional about how we are engaging our bodies, how we are engaging our sensations, instinct, intuition, the earth, relationality, and not just kind of playing with ideas without even contextualizing like to what end and how, right? And knowing that that's always already embodied. Maybe that means like people just hanging out with fluorescent lights on campuses and cubicles and thinking that that's disembodied, but it's not neutral. Like, they're exerting a carbon footprint, and it's definitely embodied, maybe in a way that's problematic, but not pretending like we're brains in vats and just perpetuating some Cartesian dualism unnecessarily, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I guess you maybe just made me think about the tyranny of idea, you know, because ideas, you know, like I say, we find safety. I mean, look at what happens with religion or with doctrine or with dogma, right? The problem with all of those things is they're idea-centric. But then it was just like that Cree elder that said, you know, in her way said, you know, one difference I say that white people have ideas, Native people have vision. An idea is only accessible at a given time to a certain amount of people, whereas vision has to be manifest and collective. Now, to me, I feel like we're also pioneers, or if you will, scientists, about the dialectic between the two. Because of course idea is important. Of course idea, theory isn't everything, right? But of course vision to me is the frontier, because we learn vision is considered a primitive concept. Just in the way that emotion was considered a primitive concept.
For sure. Right. Well, and I mean, that's kind of begging the question. I know that we're probably just about at time, but I mean, this is, again, like part two for the sequel. So much to get into. Like, how are you going to close that without so much for us to get into there?
Yeah. Hold on to that. Mic drop. Boom.
Yeah, I know. And we're done. No, I mean, the thing about that is, again, it's really, just begging the epistemological question, how in the hell do people think they know to begin with, right? And if we're not really consciously interrogating that, of course, it's going to be so much easier for you to be deluded by the same old, right, oppressive conceptual trappings that have always served to obfuscate power dynamics. And we see that happening all the time in so many different ways around us, whether it may be, I mean, within some spaces that people, right, seem to be starting to get some sense of, right, the problematics of, right, being what they might call caught in your head, so to speak, in. Then they're like, oh, I'm just into emotional intelligence, like, fuck thinking. And it's like, oh, really? Like, who benefits from your not knowing how to critically think, or your community's not knowing how to critically think? And then they actually think that's deep. So that's in, you know, in the settler-colonial US, I'd go so far as to say the vast majority of spaces where people get off on talking about emotional intelligence, super anti-intellectual, right, in the conventional sense. And then also in the vast majority of spaces where people talk about embodied wisdom or somatic wisdom or intelligence, super anti-intellectual, not a lot of critical thinking going on in those spaces at all whatsoever. And that's astoundingly problematic and needs to change yesterday, right? Because within reality, those modes of perception are not in competition. So what does it mean that people are perpetuating the same, right, divide and conquer, categorization, classification, just like see yourself as these disparate parts that are in competition with one another, instead of pausing to interrogate who told you that story to begin with? Like, is that ancestral? Maybe, but if you haven't even paused to ask, then it sure might not be, right?
Yeah, and I think what you pointed out is that So yeah, there's the emotional intelligence, which in one sense is positive, that people say, oh, we discovered that emotion is okay, subjectivity is okay. But then the way they engage it is with as an idea, as a thing, right? Because then you have books about it, right? So to me, in one sense, it's actually anti-intellectual. To me means it's different, because I think we think of anti-intellectual, we're trying to think about it as against ideas and against thinking, right? And there's a part of me that says, no, what we really mean by that, or what I mean by anti-intellectual, is that it's the privileging of the intellect as in opposition to other aspects of knowledge, how we know, right? And so that's why I understand, and because the anti-intellectual impulse is people resisting even the Trump reactionaries, saying we're tired of ideas being used against us. Well, let's be real. What they're saying is like, hey, in oppression, ideas get used against us. That's why we don't like science. Well, you've discovered half the contradiction, but what you've left out is that you got ideas too, and you're not mad at the fact that somebody's using ideas against you. You want to be in control of the ideas yourself. You're not an anti-intellectual, actually. You're against a certain set of ideas that come out of intellectual formation. Mm-hmm. You want to be the deep state.
Exactly. Like, well, my ideas aren't actually ideas. They're just like reality, like just
yeah, right.
in the singular and monolithic. But like these other people saying other things, to hell with all of that. Like, stop that immediately, right?
Well, yeah. So that raises the question of patriarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because patriarchy is more complex than just even ideological, right? It is a complex, right?
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
Well, I wish, yeah. No, I was going to say, I wish we had more time to get into that, but we are actually just about at time. So do you have any closing remarks or ideas to share, wrapping things up based off of everything that we have been getting into?
Well, I'm sort of confused. No, I just wanted to say that I love being in this kind of engagement. It makes me feel that all of these years of work, I've been at this for almost 4.5 decades now, right? And that to meet you and learn from you, learn from these people I'm working with, this eco-feminist, the riffs, that's what I love about the hip hop thing, the riffs on these ideas, the dialectic in motion is really important. And I know that the people you're working with and the people I'm working with, they're the next generation of people who are, in the way I always tell them, they say, what do you mean by epistemology? Because I show them this Ivan Jabara, the Brazilian theologian. I said, because I have one young person from the hood, she says, you mean we need to know our no, right? And I go, yeah, you just quoted, you're a step ahead of Jabara on this. She goes, oh, that's epistemology? I go, don't worry about it, but yeah, Anyway, I just want to say to you that it feels current. I hope we're current. I trust you. I could trust you because you're not afraid to be in the world in the different places, and you use your ability to be within different spaces with different women, with different people, to say, okay, let me stay away. I'm telling young people all, they say, what do we do here in the States? I go, get out of here for a minute if you can. Go to Ecuador, go to Mexico, go to Africa, go see what other people are doing. There are feminists in those spaces, there are indigenous people in those spaces, and there are teachers. So I appreciate you for that and this opportunity, because I think a lot of our learning comes out of our ability to be lucky enough to be in other contexts with other teachers. So anyway, yeah, that's my spot on here too.
Yeah.
I feel that thanks to you.
Absolutely. No, and thank you as well. And what a fantastically well-suited kind of note to close out on related to humility. So I appreciate that, right? And for folks to remember that teachers, right, provided we're doing the work of political education, are, right, consistently engaged in some kind of practice of checking to see, is this actually current or attuned or present, right? And having that humility to pause and to see what can we consistently learn from one another, right, instead of just taking for granted the way that we have been operating previously. So thank you for closing us out on that note around humility, and thank you to all of our listeners also.